Harvestry asks, oh, they did Latino dinosaurs. I'm guessing they did it badly. So here's what wasn't great about it. Yeah, let's talk about Ixalan. So, for people who don't know, Ixalan was a magic set or block, right? It was like a two set block, um, which was about this sort of Mesoamerican themed group that lives in these lands, and in these lands there are also dinosaurs, right? And sort of the main conflict comes between them and basically vampire conquistadors, right? Literally, quite literally, vampire conquistadors. So, what's the problem with that? There's kind of an immediate issue in that there are like at any given point, 0 Latino people working for WotC, right? 0 people whose cultures they're drawing from as inspiration for this. And so they're not going to know, right? And the prime example of this is it Huatli, the planeswalker that that they've touted as like, look, we have a Latino planeswalker, and get really weirded out when Latinos online and at conventions are like, this character is not Latino, right? It's like Teferi is a black planeswalker because to be black you have to have like skin of a certain color and certain features, right? Like people are visibly black. Latinos are actually an ethnocultural group. There is an ethnocultural factor to being black, especially being black in the United States or Caribbean or like any diaspora, right? But being black is a physical aspect, whereas being Latino is a cultural aspect. That does involve some physical traits as well. It's complicated. So you can't have Magic the Gathering Latinos unless it's set in the real world. Latinos don't exist. Just like you can't have a planeswalker who wears a hijab and say she's Muslim. They would never do that because Islam doesn't exist in the world of Magic. Neither do Latinos. Mexico doesn't exist in the world of Magic. Spain doesn't exist in the world of Magic. None of Latin America exists. If you don't come from a Latin American group, you can't be Latino, and so you can't have Latinos from fictional lands, right? It was the same thing when Disney came out with. You guys wouldn't know this because it's a show for little baby kids, unless you got kids. With Elena of Avalor, and they put her out. She was on like the Disney Channel. They put her out as like, look, we've made a Latina princess, and sure enough, us Latinos showed up, or Latinxes showed up en masse and said, no, she's not. It's like, we're glad to have a Spanish-speaking princess, and we're glad to have a darker-skinned princess and a princess that has some Latino aspects, but you can't be Latino if you're not Latino, right? You can't be Latino if you're not from Earth. When you think about something like Jewish people, that's a very complex identity, right? It's cultural, it's ethnic, it's political, it's religious. There's all of these aspects, and you can't just replicate that in a fantasy world, right? Unless you also replicate out all of human history, which means it's actually not a fantasy world anymore. That's the deal with like the Latino dinosaurs, right? It's like Ixalan is not a setting that has any Latinos in it because you can't have Latinos in it. And so it kind of fails in that regard. The other aspect of it is that, like one of the greatest and worst things that has happened is colonialism, right? And Ixalan kind of, the conquistadors are clearly the bad guys. Like, that's okay, but it kind of retrudges really the, like... It's funny that Ixalan has the dinosaurs, and actually that the meteor that killed the dinosaurs landed in Mexico, because Ixalan kind of recreates the single most traumatic impact to Latin America, which is the conquest, right? The Spanish conquest of Mexico and Central and South America and islands in the Caribbean and all this stuff. along with the Portuguese in Brazil and other places, and the French in certain places, and probably the Dutch got in there. So yeah, it just kind of like replicates this trauma, this tragedy again, just totally borrowing it and like sprinkle it on top like it's seasoning. And it's like, for some people it's not. For some people that's their culture, and that's not something that you get to do without literally any Latinos taking part in it. You know, it's like you don't just get to do that. So I wasn't playing Magic when Ixalan came out. Believe it or not, like Aztec dinosaurs was not enough to get me back into Magic. I kind of took a huge hiatus. Um, I we bought a pack. Like we bought like somehow we end. I think somebody bought me a booster box of Ixalan, so I have a bunch of Ixalan cards, but I just I didn't boycott Ixalan because I was like, oh, you're being bad with like representation or whatever. That wasn't it. I just wasn't playing Magic, and when I looked at it and they're like, oh, they're doing Mesoamerican stuff, I'm glad I'm not into Magic right now. I'm glad I'm not doing Magic right now because, even if the implementation of like cool dinosaurs and all this other stuff and some Latino culture and some indigenous Mesoamerican culture stuff is well put together, I just don't want to deal with it. It's like there's just other places where I'm going to see a better version of it. Harvestry says, right, it has very specific connotations. Allegory and inspiration are one thing, but yeah, it must ring really hollow when a company touts itself as having representation when it's a fiction with some distilled aspects of real life people. Yeah, absolutely. Abbott MG says, for me, it was annoying that they made this proud warrior poet society, but when I looked at the cards, that wasn't there in the mechanics. It was just dinosaur tribal and fighting, right? It's like Magic is a game about fighting, so what it cares about is fighting. And nowadays Magic works pretty hard to make cards that show aspects that aren't fighting, but ultimately they're used for fighting anyway. So there's that. It made it feel tacked on. Abbott MG continues. And tacking the indigenous flavor onto the prehistoric beast support mechanics felt borderline insulting to me. Yeah, totally. I mean, if they were going to give the dinosaurs to somebody, I'm glad that they gave it to the Aztecs. But also, Mesoamerican dinosaurs are like themselves a weird trope that exists, just like Mesoamerican vampires. I'm like, at least they did it this way, right? At least they didn't give the vampires to the Mesoamericans, which is something that a lot of people do. I was reading like the Dresden Files role-playing game for Fate, and it's like, yeah, all of these vampires in Mexico, and I'm like, Vampire the Masquerade also makes like all of these vampires be based in Mexico. It's like, what is it about Mexico that makes you think it's full of vampires? Like, how afraid are you of like Latin Americans? Then you say like, oh no, that place has got to be full of vampires. So yeah, anyway, that's my diatribe on Ixalan and why I think WotC is like, I don't know, to say that they dropped the ball on it. It's like they weren't trying. They weren't. It's like it just sucks when they pat themselves on the shoulder over it, because that pat is not deserved, right? It's like they made a Mesoamerican setting with like dinosaurs and vampires and stuff. That's fine. That's cool. It's not that big a deal. Although to some people it is. And that's fair. But it just feels like it feels disingenuous that, as far as I know, at no step in the process did they ever say, hey people that descend from this culture, is this okay? And here's the thing. I'm mestizo, right? So I'm like half Spanish, half indigenous. So for us in Mexico, a lot of that story has been erased anyway. But for the indigenous people of Mexico, that are pure indigenous, they are still to this day discriminated against, and they are still to this day poorer than everyone else in Mexico, every other group in Mexico. And these are the people that still have a connection, right? The Maya people, when they think about like, oh yeah, the ancient Mayans, the Maya people still exist. You know, when people think about the Aztecs, the Nahua people still exist, right? These are still people that have this cultural patrimony, right? That have this connection to this work and to this history and to this mythology. And I can assure you, not a single one of them made any money on Ixalan, right? But Hasbro made money hand over fist because every year is Magic the Gathering's best year. Like Magic the Gathering is on a huge roll, and it just keeps making more money and more money and more money, right? So when you're a white person and your team is mostly white with a European ascendancy, when you move your focus to Africa or Latin America or, I don't know, maybe even Australia. I mean, definitely Australia. Or India or Asia, you start to run into problems because you are looking at it, like no matter what, you're looking at it through a colonial lens. And it's very hard to shake that. You need other people there. Like it's such a weird thing because you need you're telling me that I have to hire other people and their whole job is to tell me that I'm wrong, when somebody is like, oh, here's a fun thing, and it's actually like a terrible stereotype that actually hurts people. That's what happens when you don't have sensitivity readers. And more importantly, that's what happens when you don't have people of the groups that you're writing about in your staff, right? I am dying because I want to see Encanto so bad. That's the new Disney movie set in Colombia. And I'm like, I just really want to see it because I know that Disney has really come a long way since they tried to trademark or copyright the phrase Day of the Dead in Mexico, you know, like huge idiots. And again, Coco really turned it around for them. Moana did. They're now consulting with people. Like, it's still like their directors are still like the same white guys, but now they're bringing people in from those cultures to advise them on them, right? And Magic could do that. Hasbro has the money to do that. They just don't care yet. But they will. They will because they also see what goodwill looks like, right? Like, for example, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but supposedly Narset, the Planeswalker, is on the spectrum. So she has some level of autism, right? And it's like people are like responding generally kind of positive to it. They're like, oh my God, it's amazing. Like, I'm on the spectrum. It's amazing to see, like, I'm not saying I am, I'm like being a person. I'm on the spectrum, and it's amazing to see a Planeswalker who is on the spectrum. And it's like, there's nothing cultural about autism, right? People are autistic. People of all cultures or whatever are autistic. So, oh, nice. I love mirror armor. Anyway, so you can actually have people who are autistic. You can have, you know, things that have nothing to do with culture, you can have. Just like you can have black people, you can have sort of more indigenous Latin American looking people. You can have autistic people, you can have trans people, you can have non-binary people, because those aren't culturally dependent, right? So Wizards is starting to see, you know, it's like Nico, I think, is like a non-binary planeswalker who's good, because they kind of had a non-binary planeswalker who was like a creepy weirdo. Blue-black character, I forget the name, but it's like now there's like a blue-white character who's non-binary, and they're not a creepy weirdo. So it's like, right, it's like they're getting there, they're kind of learning, they're figuring it out. So the more they see that and the more positive responses they get, the more they're going to want to do that. It's totally for terrible capitalistic reasons, but it's fine.